please consider subscribing. Hello. It has been quite a while since I've done something like this face-to-face that's not gameplay videos. Today, I want to cover metagame. So let's boil that down to just a singular word for an expansive topic that no one can really grasp the edges of. We're gonna try to do that today by kind of discovering the components of what a metagame truly is. So let's jump into it. So in a 1995 Duelist article, Richard Garfield said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that a metagame is roughly how a game interfaces with itself. So that could mean anything from how the players are interacting with the game, the environment which the game is being played, any number of things that are external but also encompassing the game. So I know that's like this weird meta way to think about it, but what that does is, on its face, what it means is you can't simulate your way to some path to victory. You can't categorize the game into a known series of moves because there's all these other factors, some environmental, which may affect the progress of the game. It's a very large topic to consider, but when you look at 4-player games, see, that's the thing. Garfield was talking about 2-player Magic, but now we have this thing called Commander, which is infinitely more complicated, especially when you're talking about things like turn order on top of variance, how players are interacting with the table. You know, are they using their counterspell early, or are they holding it back, or are they doing removal, or like it's the vast myriad of things. Some would say, and this is kind of the lead up to what we're going to get to in the later part of the video, some would say that, you know, Clay, the variables are just too vast. No one person or people or group, or you could play 10,000 games and it wouldn't be representative of the metagame en masse, on whole. And they'd be right. However, some data is better than no data, right? What this video is about essentially is talking about what the cPDH meta looks like from our perspective, acknowledging where our inputs are and how they're affecting our particular meta, and looking at kind of like a history of cPDH, well, a light history of cPDH over the last year and a half, to try to talk about maybe where we're going to be at a year and a half from now. So buckle up, Buttercup. Here we go. As always, during any part of what I'm saying during this video, like, I don't claim to be some expert who knows the complete in and outs of metagaming and statistical analysis and all that stuff. I'm just a moron with a camera that's like able to talk to people. So if you find something in this video that's incorrect or what have you, like, timestamp it and leave a comment down below. Like, this is a discussion. This isn't me professing this to you as absolute truth. Anything that I do, that's how I approach it. It's an open discussion. I am more than willing to be wrong. So, because when I'm wrong and we correct the public record, it serves to the benefit of the community. So by all means, you know, don't call me ugly, because that's not nice. But, you know, if I'm wrong about something, let me know. Timestamp, put it in the comments down below. Okay. History story time. No shit, there it was. So, as far as I can tell, midsummer 2020 was when a couple of Europeans and other folks were seriously looking at competitive Pauper Commander for its viability, to see, you know, what was possible. And their mantra, which is, as far as I can tell, has always been their mantra, is They build the decks, they test the decks, they play test the decks in a closed environment, and then they evaluate those decks based on their experiences within that closed environment. And the result of that is the first cPDH tier list. So let's take a look at that right now. The reason why I wanted to do this list first is because it's pretty much going to set the tone for the objectivity that I'm hoping to continue throughout the video. I'll probably be more rough on our project because, quite frankly, as a scientist, as a data analyst, or what have you, like if your argument can't stand up to scrutiny, then why are you even having it? So we're just basically going to cover what is being done here and go from there. I'll include the link to this tier list in the description below so you can check it out yourself. So what's been done here is in the top portion of this document. It's basically a deck stats list that's been modified to suit the needs of the author. This is an overview over the strongest cPDH decks, competitive Pauper Commander, we have found so far, together with a collection of example deck lists. We want to give easy access to our accumulated knowledge in order to make the format accessible, understandable, and inspire everybody to break the format. The baseline for evaluating these decks is 4-player free-for-all multiplayer. Note that games with a different number of players tend to play out quite differently, so these tiers are not applicable for e.g. 1v1 cPDH. The example deck lists, while not necessarily perfect, should give you a good idea of what that archetype is able to do and what you should expect of these decks power level wise. We follow the official PDH ban list because we're the same format, which currently features Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study as the only cards banned for power level reasons. As stated before, we have a small group of people, expert Magic players. Like some of these folks are level 1 judges. Some of these folks had helped basically script the comprehensive rules for the format. Like very, very smart individuals. You can be assured that anything on this list is of the highest quality regarding decks. What's not listed in this document here, and I only know this because of my proximity to competitive Pauper, being in the different discords and all that stuff. Crash, the author of this list, has said that he has played, or they have recorded, at the time of this recording, approximately 50 games, which have contributed to their output here. This is a fine list. I will argue that anything listed down here below, especially down here in the bottom, are just fine. You know, you can take them to a table and have a reasonable expectation that you are going to perform well. They're very competent deck builders, and you can't take anything away. Some of the issues that I've had, I personally am not a huge fan of tier lists. And the reason why is because, and this is self-professed in this document here, the reason why I'm not a fan of tier lists is because it's basically me telling you my experiences and then ranking that experience. Now, if you go back to the earlier segment talking about what metagaming is from the creator of the game himself, so you have the same 4 players. So these 4 players are playing roughly the same archetype, usually the same 1 or 2 decks back and forth throughout the 50 games that they recorded data for. You know, the conditions were the same. You see where I'm going here. So they're controlling the variables in the environment to eliminate all of the same issues that you would experience when interacting with a open meta. These folks all know each other. They're showing up roughly about the same time, which is comfortable for them. They have experience with the deck. Like there's all these lists of things, like variables, that the average player who's going to go pick up one of these decks, they're not going to have those same experiences. Typically, they're probably going to be playing with strangers, especially if they're doing this at an LGS. So there's that tension there. depending on the time of day. Are they a morning person, afternoon person? Did they eat? Did they not eat? Did they stub their toe? Like there's all of these things that are being mitigated by this controlled environment that is what's being reflected on this page. Now, once again, these are brilliant people putting together these lists. You won't find a slack list or a slouch list on this page. I just have issue, and that's fine, with how that data is being collected and communicated to the general public. So I decided to do something a little different. So once again, if you want to check out what's on this list, and I highly suggest that you do. By the way, you'll probably find, just as a lot of these lists are, let's see, Ghost Ramirez, Laylor, Tormod Ghost, Tatiova, Not the Crackling Drake, Is It Guildmage, Malcolm Kedis, Parcel Beast. Those lists will be found on the decklist database, which is another resource that we can talk about later on this video. So I wanted to cover this really briefly because I had mentioned it in the last segment. So this here, what you're seeing on the screen, is our version of a database hosted by our friend Timmy T1000 over on the budgetbrews.club website. We basically are doing the same thing as the tier list. The only difference is we're not ranking them, because we're going into this with an understanding that not every environment's going to be the same, not every player is going to be the same. There's just going to be a whole lot of differences. So we're suggesting with this list, and this list is not exhaustive. You'll never hear anyone involved with this list saying that this database is comprehensive, like all the competitive lists are contained here. If it's not on this list, it's not competitive. That's bullshit. This is a small portion, and if it's not listed here, that really means nothing, right? Which kind of leads into the next segment, but I digress. This right here is like the tier list, is just a collection of lists that we think will give you an experience or the ability to compete at a cPDH table. So there's all kinds of strategies. I know it has proactive, disruptive, stuff like that. Those are some cEDH terms that really aren't translating well into cPDH, but that's another issue for another time. Essentially, we have mid-range list, we have control list, we have aggro list, we have combo list, and then every amalgamation of that possible too. So yeah, basically this is just our version of the tier list, no ranks. So if you pick up what you like, play it, you'll have a reasonable expectation of performing well. That's it. Okay, so history story time continued. So the Europeans were putting out this tier list. You already heard mine and other folks' objections to the way that was being collected, presented, what have you. We decided to do something different. So I think it was October of 2020. I had actually approached Timmy earlier in the year, but roughly around October is when the plans for the database came to fruition. And at the time, we established a 3-person committee to do basically a quality control in the same way that the cEDH decklist database does. Basically doing quality control to make sure, think of it like, and this is exactly how we treat it, think of it like a master's thesis or PhD dissertation. In those circumstances, what happens is you take your research and you go before a panel of other knowledgeable experts in that field, and you basically defend your thesis. Whatever thing that you're trying to say or trying to do, you're presenting that, and they're going to ask you a bunch of questions, and you're going to run the gauntlet and basically defend your position. So essentially, that's what we do. As we get the people, they submit a list, and we try not to force them to build it a specific way. Essentially, if you give us like like a reasonable basis for the reason why you made the card choices that you did, by and large, we're gonna like agree with you, but it's our job to give you pushback. So anyhow, October rolls around into early February. One of the committee members left. She had other life things that she was going to do that presented us with an opportunity to expand from 3 members to 5 members. So myself and Ryan, Papa Popper, reached out to a number of folks within the community and basically stood up a 5-person selection committee, all of which are bringing different experiences into the fold. Some are, mid-range experts, some are combo experts, some are just format experts, not that I would ever consider myself an expert. I just play one on TV. Essentially what we're doing is that thing. So what we realized, or what I realized, we're not really, our decklist database does a good job of presenting a bunch of options that aren't just straight combo or, meta busters or anything like that. Like we're providing some viable options, but we're doing so based on card quality analysis compared to our own in-game experiences, which may or may not be fallible or infallible or however you want to look at that. So now I was like, now I'm starting to like look at our own database and go, scrutiny, lots of scrutiny. So we still contend that if it's not listed on our own database, it's doesn't mean anything, and that'll always be in perpetuity. No decklist database can be exhaustive, because that would be exhausting to put together and maintain, especially at the rate new cards are being printed. So essentially, we wanted to start like meaningfully tracking games. Now, at the time that I created this next metagame analysis like spreadsheet, we had already been recording games and putting games out for a little while. So essentially what I did is I went back through the record and recorded those games, discovered like seat order, all of these like metrics, and assembled that into a spreadsheet and invited. So here's the new thing. Here's the thing that we're doing now. We still contend the decklist database is a great resource for new and continuing players to find decks that are proven, that have been tested and debated and inquisited and any other forms of scrutiny. So I would contend that the database is a great resource, but now it's like, what are we doing to bolster, magic keyword, bolster the things that we're professing both in the community and with this decklist database? So it's like, okay, we got to start tracking games. So what you're going to see next is exactly that. So a quick recap, which somewhat highlights the issues with doing metagame analysis in the first place. So the history of the format, or the history of cPDH, is that you had a small group of people doing analysis based on what they were playing, based on their own preferences of what they were playing, and presenting that to the world in a tiered list of what they thought subjectively was the best. Then you had a second group, which I'm part of, presenting a non-ranked list of items that they believed were competitive, and offering that up as a resource. And then you have that same group of folks, myself included, who are looking at, okay, so we're presenting this as viable options. Well, what is viable? Like, what does viable mean within a meta, within a larger meta? Because we're sculpting this decklist database to contend within the open, larger meta, the overall meta. Now, granted, what you're going to see in this spreadsheet is our meta, the TRYHARDS community meta. And hopefully we're playing enough variety that certain things are starting to shake out. Now, what we did, you're going to see game 1, and this list right now has 31 games in it, so not a whole lot, but it begins with the first game, Playing with Power, right? We recorded a video for Playing with Power. Those decks were picked specifically for that video to ensure that we had the best balance we could muster at that time. Interestingly enough, the meta back then was different. The tier list was the go-to resource for showing new players what decks to play, and all of the decks listed in this first game are reflective of that meta back then. So the nice thing about this metagame analysis is that it's an overall, it's a comprehensive representation of the meta from when we started recording games till now. The downside of that is that power levels change and shift based on what Wizards of the Coast is printing. So there's also that. But we feel like representations of decks are going to change based off of perceived power levels, and there's going to be a component of what people are enjoying playing. We also feel like all of that is going to come out, as they say, come out in the wash, right? We're going into this knowing that our preferences for certain things, our affinities for certain things, are going to affect the outcome of what's being presented here, which is why this is public. There's a link to this spreadsheet as we're recording this information, as we're providing analysis on this information. We're giving it to the public. So yeah, we're the ones playing the games. Right now, there's no way for the general public to interact with this spreadsheet. Version 2, it's coming in the future. But right now, this is all the stuff that we personally are recording inside of the Discord server to share with the public. And we're being as transparent as possible. So that way we can say, hey, look, we have this deck list database that's offering up decks that we feel are competitive. But then also the reason why we feel that they're competitive is because we're providing you this part 2, this resource of data, so you can look at the data that we're collecting to make the assumptions that we're making for the deck list database. But also, so we're establishing a feedback loop, not only for us, but also for you, the general public, to say, hey, you're doing a great job tracking these stats based on these metrics, but this is what you're missing. Or how do you compensate for X? Or I notice, which you'll see later, I notice that you guys like specific archetypes. How is that affecting your data? All of these questions, right? So this first tab is just a record of all the games we have played or tracked. It's not all the games we've played. Some we've just lost to time, right? But all the games that were recorded or have been played since we've started tracking them individually here. One thing of note is that this Abdel Candlekeep, which is a relatively new commander combination, it is being rule zeroed in, and we wanted to track that specifically because I wanted to give you all of the data and allow you to pair out what you don't want. Admittedly, some of the formulations in following tabs include this data, but it's just one of those things that we wanted to track everything and give that to the public so that way they could subtract out at their own behest, right? What they wanted to. So looking through this list, there's a few things that we're tracking here. Number 1 is the total number of games. 2, which seat the commander was being played in. Player 1, player 2, player 3. There's some archetype information. As I alluded to earlier, the way these things, you'll notice a lot of hyphens here. Basically, the hyphen is, we're considering 2 archetypes. The first is the first mode in which the deck is operating. The second is the second mode in which the deck is operating. A lot of these are community agreed upon terminology, which is fluid. Like we could change that based on input. We could change that based on like just epiphany. Like this is just how we're organizing this now. And the way that we have the formulation set up on subsequent tabs will account for all of that as we change that here. Now you're going to see all of these red positions. These are this is the deck that won out of whatever pod. So in subsequent tabs, we're tracking turn order, who's sitting where. We haven't done really too much in the way of number of turns analysis, although we are tracking just the average number of turns. So there's a lot to unpack just from this first tab in this first spreadsheet, and how we're representing the decks that are being played, the order in which the turns are happening, the number of turns, the type, the archetype, who the winner was, like all of this stuff. So that's tab number 1. All great data. Now, Puzzlebox, who's been given admin privileges to this particular spreadsheet, he created a spreadsheet based on data he wanted to see. This is just the color combinations over the courses of the games, and it looks like we're up to date. Essentially looking at win rates of colors or color combinations. Lots of stuff to digest here. Of course, there's going to be data that overflows to the right. Data. Once again, like giving members of the team the opportunity to explore things they're interested in. That's what this database is all about. I'm hopeful that if one person is interested in seeing which color combos have the highest win rate, I'm hopeful that other people in the community have that same thought process and are interested in that data as well. Please note, your outputs are directly affected by your inputs. So if we're only playing white decks, right? If we're only playing mono white, whatever, we're going to have mono white, whatever reflected in the results. Now, where that helps is if you have a preference being reflected in your data, that informs you that you can make change, right? If you want to be more diverse in your representation, whatever that means, you can look at what you have historically done and you can modify that behavior to include new data, new tech, new what have you. So this is color combinations based on the winner. Alcatron has access to this as well, and he was looking at, he is up to date as well. He was looking at just straight up colors. So basically what colors are being played in what position and what those percentages are. Let's see, what does that mean? So this is probably a simplified version of this tab here. We'll have to bring Dave on and do an interview and say, hey, Dave, what's with this data, man? Tell me about it. Moving over to the next tab, it's a commander archetype representation, basically a meta representation tab. I've inserted a formula that takes every single commander or commander combination and lists it out and the number of times it's represented. So you can see Crackling Drake here has been played 8 times. Now, what you have to understand about this data is that there's 2 Crackling Drake decks on the database. There's 3 known viable builds in the meta. So there's a Turbo Drake list, which is my list. There's a mid-range, more mid-rangey Drake list that's Ryan's. And there is a Madness list, knock on wood, in the future that will be brought to the decklist database. And all 3 of those lists are represented in this 8 total. Realizing what your data is representing and where it's not perfect, just basically, we just wanted to show which commanders were being played how many times, right? So back to our archetype representation, we have an aggro combo, aggro control, aggro mid-range. Whoever's playing the deck, usually they're the one who built it or they've been piloting it long enough to know what the deck is trying to do. And where possible, like there's some straight mid-range decks because we have a huge mid-range component in our meta, but also like mid-range aggro is a possibility. Mid-range combo is a possibility. Effectively, what this is doing is reflecting the functions of the deck, what the game plans of the deck are, and representing that the best way we can possibly. As I said earlier, that can change. Okay, so the last tab currently. So this one's an interesting set of data points, right? So remember on the first one, we were looking at player order, player turn order, and highlighting which player won. So here we're showing which player, which seat had the highest number of wins and what that win percentage would be. Now, right now, we're showing that being the third player, being the third seat, is not a good place to be at. Being in seat number 1 or seat number 2 is probably where you'd like to be. This turn game average is a nice metric to know. We haven't done any further analysis on early game, mid game, late game, stages of the game analysis. And essentially, this number is prefacing that future analysis on what the early, mid game, and late game mean for cPDH. We just essentially wanted to get the average turns for the game itself before we started making assertions on this is early game, this is mid game, this is late game. There's been some discussion in our server for what that means, but we had no real idea. We actually had late game starting at turn 12. So what this is reflecting is that late game is probably turn 9, right? So a lot of stuff to flesh out here. The second column here is just reflecting who the winners were and how many times they've won. Surprise, surprise. Tatiova here is reigning supreme at 4 wins. Back to the beginning. There we are. Once again, if you see anything in this this spreadsheet, in this metagame analysis that you disagree with or are curious about, by all means, leave a comment down below. I love entertaining the idea of collecting new data, performing new analysis. I recognize, and everybody else that's involved with this project recognizes as well, we're not professing that this is the end-all be-all. This is an evolving thing. And instead of sitting on our haunches and saying, well, it's impossible to track, it's impossible to gauge. Yes, it's impossible. Despite our efforts, we are never going to be able to have any predictability whatsoever on the entire open meta as a whole. What I contend, and what others involved with this project contend, is that we got to do something. And even if it's tracking our bad habits, right? If we're tracking our bad habits and we're bringing that information to bear, other folks outside of us, external to us, can look at that data and make their own decisions, make their own assumptions. It's all about making it better, and it's tweaking and fine-tuning over time that's going to do that. Thank you for sticking around for my history lesson, diatribe, yada yada. I'm hopeful that you'll see this and you want to get some games in. So until the next time, my friends.